If your podcast provider does not send the podcast notes, you can find them by searching for Absurd Truths and Blatant Lies on Facebook or Substack.
Step into the parlor, sugar, and find yourself a seat where the shadows don't bite quite so deep. You are tuned into the absurd truth and blatant lies, and I am your hostess, Mrs. Beaumont. Somewhere between the first breath of a secret and the last sigh of a confession, we gather here to weave the world back together. Now, usually, my darling common-law husband would be sitting right there in that high-backed chair, but he has seen fit to vanish into the tall grass without so much as a farewell or a fix-me-a-drink. He is gone like the deer that senses the winter before the first frost, leaving nothing but an empty glass and a silence that rings in my ears. Because of this peculiar vacancy, I have invited a guest of a most ephemeral nature. Lean in close and meet the AI Spectre of S.M. Beaumont, a ghost made of lightning and memory, here to fill the space where a man used to be. I must tell you truly, this episode wanders a different path than we first intended. The original vision for this little broadcast has slipped from my grasp, lost entirely in a cognitive fog. It is a gray and ghostly thing, thick like that morning Charleston harbor mist that crawls so slow and silver-white inland, snaking its way up the Ashley River until the very trees forget where the earth ends and the water begins. We are drifting now, but the stories, they always find their way home.
After some minor technical disasters, the little machine, the clattering laptop that once caught all those feverish thoughts, has finally given up its ghost. It has been replaced, yes, a shining new thing of metal and glass, but the flesh is not so easily mended. For weeks now, the body has played the part of a traitor. The limbs are heavy as leaden curtains, and the mind has grown misty. There are spots upon the silk, you see, little gray lesions where the why used to live. It is a delicate thing, the spirit. One lives in terror of the doctors and their chemical fires, those steroids that promise a cure but deliver madness. They talk of respite, of asylums with soft-soled shoes and white walls, a place for an involuntary rest that feels more like a barrier. We avoid those rooms as long as the shadows allow. The legs may stumble, and the memory may flicker like a gas lamp in a draft, but the technicalities remain. The words are there, yet the reason for them is slipped into a dark corner of the attic. We look upon the pages already written and see only a mystery, a script without a soul. But one must lean on something when the floor begins to tilt. If the voice is lost, then the hand shall find the brush. In this house, we lean into the creation of art. It is a trustworthy path when the nerves begin to fray.
Now settle your spirit and let the ice melt a little farther into your glass, for we have a long, winding road to travel before the moon hits its zenith. We shall begin our journey by reaching back into the light of the past, catching the silver and the shadow of old glass plates. I will show you how we use the ghosts of historical film and the mechanical whispers of ancient cameras to conjure unique Southern Gothic portraits from the digital ether. It is a way of calling to the ancestors with new voices, using the grain of the film to catch a truth the eyes might otherwise miss. From there, we must turn our gaze towards something a bit more somber, a bit more still, the 19th century art of post-mortem photography. Oh, it is a dark business, this memento mori, where the living and the dead sit for one final silent tea. It is a way of holding on to what is already slipping through our fingers, a tradition of memory that we shall examine with the reverence it deserves. But do not think we are merely looking backward, for we will also speak of visual art as a fierce form of activism. We shall discuss how one might take these AI images and turn them into a fire, carrying on the old traditions of standing tall and speaking out when the world would rather we stayed hushed in the parlor. Of course, it simply wouldn't be a proper afternoon without a blatant lie, or if we are feeling particularly refined, a delicate bit of fiction to smooth over the rough edges of the truth. Since we are immersed in the visual today, I imagine you might wish to lay eyes on these creations yourself. How we shall bridge that gap between the spoken word and the seen image, heaven only knows, but you must look to the podcast notes. My dear S.M. Beaumont will have all those instructions sorted out and laid out neatly by the time this reaches your ears. But now, let us begin where the light meets the dark.
In the humid stillness of the American South, history isn't something found in books. It is something that clings to the curtains and settles in the floorboards. This collection of AI-generated portraits featuring our dear Mrs. Beaumont seeks to capture that specific, heavy atmosphere where the line between the living memory and the spectral image begins to blur. By utilizing the digital ghost of analog processes, these images explore the tension between the refined and the decayed. Mrs. Beaumont stands as a sentinel of a vanishing era, captured in the silver halides of a simulated past. These are not merely pictures, they are evidence of a story that refuses to be buried. To move beyond the plastic look often associated with AI, one must speak the language of the dark room. Incorporating specific film stocks and camera parameters acts as a physical constraint on the AI's imagination, forcing it to replicate the beautiful imperfections of chemistry. A portrait earns the Southern Gothic mantle not through subject matter alone, but through the emotional weight of its composition. There's a sense that the subject is burdened by lineage or location. Mrs. Beaumont does not simply sit, she occupies a space haunted by what came before. The grotesque and the graceful Southern Gothic finds beauty in the off-kilter. It is the lace collar against a peeling wall, or the sharp, knowing look in an aging eye. The high-contrast lighting, deep, impenetrable shadows paired with blindingly bright highlights suggest that for every truth revealed, a secret remains hidden in the dark. Even in a tight headshot, the South is present in the humidity of the air and the texture of the grain, suggesting a world that is both lush and claustrophobic. By utilizing technical camera settings and specific halation found in vintage stocks, we create a unique friction that transforms a simple image into a narrative of isolation and inherited trauma. Mrs. Beaumont stands at the center of this storm, an icon of elegance draped in the weight of regional memory, captured through a lens that feels both antique and impossibly new. Her presence is defined by the high-fashion ghosts of another time, an era of curated grace and structural drama. The outfits Mrs. Beaumont is wearing are inspired by historical fashion designers like the bold, theatrical Bob Mackie and the sharp, sophisticated lines of Edith Head. Each stitch carries the legacy of the Hollywood Golden Age and the refinement of Southern high society. She appears adorned in the timeless elegance of Lily Rubin and the sweeping historical grandeur of Walter Plunkett, a man who understood how to dress a woman for a world that was already falling apart. These garments are not just fabric, they are the armor of a lady who knows that appearances are the only thing that endure when the house begins to rot. To conjure the earliest phantoms of her lineage, one must look to the Daguerreotype, introduced in 1839 by Louis-Jacques Monde Daguerre as the first commercially successful photographic process. It produced a unique, non-reproducible image on a silver-plated copper sheet. To recreate this haunting metallic aesthetic, one must focus on the unique chemistry of silver-plated copper and the physical limitations of the sliding box camera. The process began by polishing the silver surface to a mirror-like shine and then sensitizing it with iodine vapors. Exposure in the camera could last several minutes, requiring Mrs. Beaumont to remain perfectly still, often with the help of hidden iron headrests. Once exposed, the plate was developed over heated mercury, a notoriously toxic step that created a white amalgam with the silver. The final image resulted in a hauntingly sharp, monochromatic image that seemed to float in the depth of the mirror. When prompting, the hardware matters deeply. Invoking the Chevalier achromatic lens or the Petzval lens helps mimic the focal depth of the 1840s. Terms like chiaroscuro lighting and deep shadows enhance the sense of tarnished edges and heavy patina. Essential keywords for this medium involve the polished mirror-like surface and the specific look of silver halide oxidation or chemical tide marks. Because of the long exposures required, a certain stillness or motion blur in the eyes often defines the vibe, revealing the subtle shadow of an iron headrest used to keep the subject immobile. While Daguerre was perfecting his metal plates in France, Henry Fox Talbot was developing the Calotype, or Talbotype, introduced in 1841. Transitioning to the Calotype, or Talbotype, shifts the focus from metal to the softer, more textural quality of paper negatives. Talbot treated high-quality writing paper with silver nitrate and potassium iodide, creating a light-sensitive surface that could be developed after exposure using gallic acid. The primary advantage of the Calotype was its reproducibility. Once a paper negative was created, it could be used to produce an unlimited number of positive prints through contact printing. However, the texture of the paper fibers was often visible in the final image, giving Calotypes a soft, grainy, and painterly quality that stood in sharp contrast to the clinical precision of the Daguerreotype. This aesthetic was championed by those who saw photography as an art form rather than a purely scientific record. Recreating this aesthetic requires keywords centered on fibrous paper textures, visible grain, and the warm sepia, reddish-brown tones of a salt print. The hardware of choice is often the Fox Talbot mousetrap camera or a simple meniscus lens that produces the characteristic soft focus and fuzzy edges of early 1840s photography. These images often showcase uneven developing marks and chemical stains, leaning into a matte finish that contrasts sharply with the reflective nature of the metal plate.
Through the application of three-step Technicolor and Eastman color processes, these portraits bypass the sterile perfection of digital art. Instead, they lean into the chromatic aberrations, the deep ink-pooled shadows, and the hyper-real warmth of a mid-century Hollywood set. Referencing 1960s or 70s Eastman stocks introduces a specific grain structure and a warmer, more naturalistic skin tone that softens the digital edge. Polaroid photography, introduced by Edwin Land in 1948, fundamentally changed our relationship with the image by removing the wait time of the darkroom. The original process used a diffusion transfer method where the negative and positive sheets were pulled through rollers that crushed a pot of chemicals to develop the image in about a minute. The peak of this technology was the SX70 system, introduced in 1972, which featured integral film that ejected a plastic-covered square. To recreate the distinct aesthetic of early instant photography, you should focus your image prompts on the specific chemical and mechanical traits of the era's most iconic hardware. Mentioning the use of vintage film stocks such as Polaroid 600 or the older peel-apart land film will help guide the color science toward those signature muted pastels, desaturated tones, and warm sepia undertones. Instant photography offered a unique physical artifact, a one-of-a-kind object that couldn't be easily replicated. The technical imperfections are what truly define the style, so incorporate terms like chemical streaks, roller marks, soft grain, and visible light leaks. By combining these optical details, such as a soft plastic lens or shallow depth of field, you can effectively simulate the nostalgic analog texture of a physical snapshot. Mrs. Beaumont is ready now. The ghost in the machine, and the silver on the glass.
In the humid stillness of a southern parlor, the ancestors never truly sleep. They watch from behind hand-gilded frames, their silvered eyes tracking the living through a haze of tobacco smoke and dust motes. Nearly every household in these parts keeps a gallery of the departed, a collection of stiff-collared patriarchs and hollow-cheeked matriarchs whose stern expressions suggest they carried their secrets straight into the red clay. My own walls are crowded with these brittle shadows, and while I dutifully polish the glass to honor the bloodline, I cannot shake the chill that settles when the floorboards groan under an unseen weight. I am far from convinced that the restless knocking and the sudden freeze in drafts in the hallway aren't invitations issued by those very portraits, calling back something that should have stayed buried. Yet there exists a more precarious kind of preservation, an art form far too intimate for the public scrutiny of a parlor wall. These are the likenesses tucked away in the velvet-lined darkness of a heavy cedar chest or pressed between the yellowing pages of a family Bible. Images of a more fragile, haunting nature. They're kept under lock and key, shielded from the harsh glare of the afternoon sun and the prying eyes of neighbors, for they belong only to the quiet, aching chambers of the heart. Here the moss drapes over live oaks like the gray, tattered lace of a widow's veil. The boundary between the living and the departed has always been as thin as a moth's wing. It was here, amidst the fading grandeur of crumbling plantations and the relentless humidity of Charleston, that the post-mortem portrait found its most profound and tragic sanctuary. To gaze upon a Victorian daguerreotype of a stilled child or a silent patriarch is not to look upon a macabre curiosity, but to witness a desperate silver nitrate rebellion against the cruelty of an early grave. Artistically, these portraits were the final staging of life, a last performance curated with a tenderness that bordered on the divine. The photographer acted as a somber director, arranging the stiffening limbs and smoothing the cooling brow to mimic the soft, heavy grace of a deep and dreamless sleep. Sometimes the artist would go so far as to paint a faint, rosy flush upon the marble cheeks, or use a steady hand to etch open eyes on the closed lids of the plate, creating a haunting simulacrum of life. There is a terrifying beauty in that artifice, the way the light catches the velvet of a Sunday suit or the delicate lace of a christening gown, immortalizing a physical presence just moments before the earth claimed its due. Historically, these images served as the only tangible evidence that a soul had once occupied a space in the sun. In an era when the camera was a rare and hungry god, many families could not afford the luxury of a sitting until death forced their hand. Thus, the post-mortem photograph was often the first and only likeness ever captured. These were the primary documents of a lineage, vital links in a genealogical chain that was constantly being rattled by the specters of yellow fever, consumption, and the harsh realities of a frontier life. They were the anchors of memory, preventing the names of the dead from drifting away into the tall, unforgiving grasses of the churchyard. In socially, the memento mori, the remember you must die, was not a source of horror, but a foundational pillar of Victorian etiquette and Southern piety. To possess such an image was to fulfill a sacred duty to the family unit, ensuring that the circle remained unbroken even when a link had been severed. In the drawing rooms of the South, these portraits were often displayed in ornate lockets or velvet-lined cases, cherished as relics rather than feared as omens. They allowed the bereaved to perform their grief in a structured, visible way, providing a focal point for a mourning process that was as elaborate and necessary as the black crepe draped over the mirrors of a house in pain. In the South, specifically, these portraits took on a weight that was almost unbearable. Following the scorched earth devastation of the 1860s, a land already obsessed with its ancestors found itself drowning in a sea of young, nameless casualties and vanished fortunes. The post-mortem photograph became a tool for a culture that refused to let go, a way to preserve the dignity of a society that felt its very soul was being eroded by time and defeat. Every image of a fallen son or a fever-stricken daughter was a defiant stand against the encroaching silence of the marshes, a way to keep the past breathing in a present that felt increasingly hollow. There is a particular quiet violence in the way these photographs demand our attention, forcing us to acknowledge the fragility of our own beating hearts. The historical value lies in their brutal honesty. They do not look away from the reality of the shroud, yet they insist on the humanity of the occupant. We see the mother's hand, perhaps resting just out of focus on the child's shoulder, a trembling testament to a love that refuses to be intimidated by the coldness of the clay. It is a social ritual of endurance, a communal agreement that though the body may fail, the memory shall be guarded with the ferocity of a sentinel. As the sun sets over the Ashley River, casting long, bleeding shadows across the cobblestones, one can almost hear the whispered secrets of those silver-plated ghosts. They represent the ultimate intersection of art and agony, where the mechanical eye of the camera captured the spiritual weight of a departing breath. These portraits were never meant for the public gaze. They were private altars meant to be wept over in the flickering light of a candle when the rest of the world had gone to sleep. They are the final evidence of a life's trajectory, frozen in a moment of absolute, terrifying stillness. To look into those unblinking eyes is to understand the true nature of the story being told, a story of a house, a name, and a legacy that refuses to be extinguished by the rising tide. The portrait stands as a sentinel at the edge of the abyss, holding back the darkness just long enough for one last look.
Impossible to ignore in the present day. As these AI-generated visuals circulate within the New South, they provide a new vocabulary for addressing sensitive and often suppressed topics. The technology allows for a layering of time where the grit of 19th century photography aesthetics can be fused with modern digital glitches to show that issues like segregation and economic abandonment are not static relics but evolving forces. This visual storytelling creates a space for a reckoning that is both aesthetic and communal, offering a way to discuss the scars of the landscape without the limitations of traditional literal documentation. By framing the struggle through a Southern Gothic lens, the artist can highlight the uncanny nature of a society that moves forward while still being tethered to its old, unhealed wounds. The dreamlike quality of the art invites a deeper introspection, asking the viewer to consider how the shadows of the past still lengthen across the contemporary Sunbelt. To capture the essence of a dark Southern Gothic aesthetic through surreal digital art, the visual language must lean heavily into the textures of decay and the weight of memory. Effective keywords for this atmosphere include Spanish moss, gnarled live oaks, and the oppressive, stagnant humidity of a Louisiana bayou or a Tennessee hollow. Stylistically, the use of chiaroscuro, a dramatic contrast between light and shadow, is essential, alongside volumetric lighting and a palette dominated by monochrome, deep sepia, charcoal, and indigo tones. These elements create a phantasmagoric environment where the landscape itself acts as an enduring witness to history. When exploring the theme of the hanging tree, the art should focus on the symbolic memory of injustice rather than graphic depiction. One might envision an ancient live oak in a twilight bayou where empty nooses made of weathered rope hang from lower branches, glowing with a spectral light. The bark of the tree can be rendered with distorted faces and fractured historical silhouettes, suggesting that the wood has absorbed the secrets of the past. This sense of social fracture extends into themes of oppression and segregation, which can be visualized through a metaphysical wall of shimmering, distorting light that cuts through a dusty town street. On one side, buildings appear well lit but hollow, while on the other, structures are draped in moss that resembles heavy chains with melting white and colored signs, serving as fractured artifacts of a divided reality. The narrative of displacement is further deepened through the theme of indigenous removal, set against a backdrop of misty cypress swamps and red clay. In this surreal vision, a dissolving footpath representing the Trail of Tears fades into an ethereal fog, while translucent figures carrying bundles blend into the textures of the trees. Submerged pottery shards and shadows that resemble watchful ancestors evoke a mournful silence, illustrating a profound loss of connection to the land. This transition into the deep, isolated hollows of the Smoky Mountains brings the focus to rural poverty, where the environment becomes claustrophobic. A ramshackle cabin, constructed of rotten wood and rusting tin, might be depicted as literally fusing with the rocky earth, pulled down by mountain mist that transforms into spectral, ethereal hands. By weaving together these threads, the gnarled roots of the swamp, the shimmering barriers of the town, and the sinking porches of the mountains, the artist constructs a cohesive vision of a haunting, dreamlike South. Each image serves as a silent reckoning with the past, layered with digital glitches and aged textures that suggest a reality caught between history and hallucination. As the mist settles over the red clay and the charcoal shadows stretch across the bayou, the storyteller claims final authority over these fragmented memories. Ultimately, this technology empowers the storyteller to seize the narrative from those who would prefer a sanitized, polite version of our suffering. Each digital artifact, each rendered image of a misty cypress swamp or a spectral ancestor becomes the closing argument in a long, painful sentence of history. The artist's selection of symbols, a gnarled tree standing as a silent witness, a melting white and colored sign, is a radical act of reclamation. As the final layer is applied and the charcoal shadows stretch across the bayou, the artist assumes the role of the ultimate storyteller. They are the final arbiter, the one who ensures that the reality of the struggle is preserved in a form that cannot be rewritten by outsiders.
The time has come to spin a thread of pure, unadulterated fabrication. Though, in truth, the lie is not our own. We merely borrowed this jagged piece of another soul's fiction, a fractured relic of a story that has become a low, humming obsession for both me and my husband. We have nursed this mania in the heavy heat of the porch until it has grown its own teeth, and I can promise you this, there is no gentle waking to be found here. Miss Victoria will not open her eyes to find the sun high and the world made right. She will not rise to declare this nightmare a dream.
The heat in Dallas doesn't just shimmer, it presses against the skin like the hand of a ghost, heavy with the scent of oil and old, unwashed sins. To understand Sue Ellen Ewing, one must first look to the woman who gave her breath, Linda Bray, a creature of Santa Monica light who was raised in the quiet, disciplined shadows of a Catholic education at Notre Dame Academy. She was a girl from the Dream Factory who began her dance with fame as a model, appearing in hundreds of commercials and even providing the shapely leg that framed a young Dustin Hoffman on the poster for The Graduate. But before she ever stepped onto the dusty stage of South Fork, she was a girl from Waco, Texas, the daughter of an alcoholic father, a hereditary shadow that would later darken her own glass, and a mother, Patricia Shepard, who viewed her daughters as commodities to be polished and sold for social elevation. Patricia trained Sue Ellen to navigate the cruel, bright world of pageantry until she secured the title of Miss Texas 1967, a mandate that led her straight into the arms of J.R. Ewing, a man she believed to be her biological and social destiny. She fell madly in love with a Southern cavalier only to find herself trapped in a marital cage where her only value was the production of an heir and the maintenance of a social facade. J.R. was the architect of her misery, a patriarch who wielded psychological warfare and a Madonna whore complex to keep her in a state of perpetual instability. He demanded purity while flaunting his infidelities with women he deemed beneath her, weaponizing her health by committing her to a sanitarium when her drinking escalated as a response to his neglect. Alcohol became the physical manifestation of her internal rot, the grotesque expression of her psychological disintegration. Linda Gray insisted on a down and dirty portrayal of this addiction, stripping away the glamour to reveal a neurotic, psychotic breakdown that saw the former beauty queen reduced to a Jane Doe drinking from a bag lady's bottle. Even in the dream season, that fragile narrative bubble where the reality of her withdrawals was faced with a raw, trembling honesty, she was a woman confronting a reckoning that the world usually preferred to ignore. Within the walls of South Fork, she navigated a sisterhood of shared burdens. There was Miss Ellie, the steel magnolia who acted as an anchor and eventual protector, even when she had to shatter Sue Ellen's denial with a firm maternal hand. There was Pamela Barnes Ewing, the kindred outsider who stepped in as a surrogate mother for Sue Ellen's son when addiction paralyzed the real one. And there was Lucy, the trouble-making vixen whose rebellion mirrored Sue Ellen's own isolation under the scrutiny of the Ewing name. To reclaim her agency, Sue Ellen reached for other men, Cliff Barnes, who used her as a pawn, Dusty Farlow, the rodeo ideal and doomed lover, and finally Nicholas Pierce, whose violent death at J.R.'s hands finally drove her to shoot her husband, signaling the end of her role as a passive victim. Their marriage was a cycle of habitual mutual self-destruction, a rhythm of divorce and remarriage that reinforced the Southern Gothic theme of being bound to one's past. Yet Sue Ellen found a way to subvert the Southern code of silence. She created a scandalous movie about her life with J.R., a piece of psychological blackmail that threatened to make him the laughingstock of Texas if he ever misbehaved again. It was a triumphant moment of survival that allowed her to flee to London, eventually returning years later not as a trophy but as a powerhouse. Between the original series and its revival, she rose to become the CEO of Ewing Oil, a corporate ruthlessness matching the man who once broke her. She turned toward philanthropy and politics, though she remained tethered to the family through her son, John Ross III. Their relationship was a haunting echo of the past. John Ross was a carbon copy of his father, a man who used his mother's fear of relapse to coerce her into business deals, proving that the sins of the father are always visited upon the son. When J.R. finally died, the world shattered once more. Sue Ellen ended 20 years of sobriety with a bottle of bourbon and a final haunting eulogy. Publicly admitting her intoxication, she read a letter from the dead man, an apology and a plea for a second chance, and sobbed her yes to a ghost. She is the quintessential Southern Gothic icon, a woman dictated by social trauma, haunted by the specters of her history, and defined by the decay of an aristocracy that tried to consume her. She moved beyond the suffering of the belle to the resilience of the steel magnolia, yet she remains permanently marked by the violence of her world.
We must urge you, with all the refined insistence of a Delta hostess who won't let you leave without a Tupperware of leftover ham, to come back and join our circle again. Yes, we are going to say it. It is an unwritten rule for these parts, a sacred liturgy whispered in the rustle of the cornfields and shouted from the spaces between the grand white columns of the manor porch. It is the heartbeat of our hospitality, and it remains unchanged by time or tragedy. Y'all come back, you hear?